Bruh.
That was close. This is the Sony 20mm f1.8. And this is the first lens that I got with my Sony a7 IV. And we're going to talk about 20mm lens or wide angle lenses in general, but in particular this lens. So let's get into that. So when it comes to a 20mm, 20mm isn't a super common focal length. Definitely not as common as, let's say, 24mm or even something like 16mm. It's somewhere in the middle. It's exactly in the middle of those two numbers, because that's how maths works. But it is technically in the ultra wide range of focal length. Basically anything less than 24mm is considered ultra wide, because 24mm is the widest end of your standard range, which is like you'd have your 24 to 70 as a standard zoom. So the 20mm is wider than that, so it's going to be ultra wide. And ultra wide lenses are very commonly used for landscape photography and stuff like that, vlogging as well. Although this lens in particular, I don't know how often it is used for vlogging. It definitely is by some people. It's definitely not as common as, let's say, a 16 to 35. Like the 16 to 35 G Master is like the standard. If you're like a full-on vlogger with an A7S III, you have a 16 to 35 G Master, I'm sure. Also heard rumors that they're making a version 2 of that coming out soon, so that's kind of cool. And it's also used a lot for real estate photography and videography in particular, because it allows smaller spaces to seem bigger, and as well for like architecture photography, stuff like that, because you can see, you know, the entire building sort of thing. But that's not all it can be used for. You can take portraits with, you know, 20mm, or even you can go even wider than that. It's a very different look compared to an 85 like I'm using here. Like this is what a portrait would look like with an 85, but with a 20mm, portraits just, they have a different look. And I'll explain why in a minute. But I think wider focal lengths, not necessarily 20mm, but wider focal lengths in general, are often used in photography to make it a bit more of an editorial look, like in fashion photography and stuff like that. If you're trying to make, you know, a model's legs look longer, or make a space look bigger, or a building look taller, stuff like that, wide angle lenses are good for that. And that's because of compression. And I've talked about compression before, and how the higher a focal length gets, it seems as though the background gets closer to the subject. And, you know, the wider you get, the opposite's going to happen. It's going to push the foreground and background further away in the image. So you can get this cool effect if you have something that is in that axis going towards or away from the camera. You can make limbs look very long, can make buildings look very tall, stuff like that. So it can have a very interesting effect, rather than just being like, this is an 85, we're just flattening everything out, blurring out the background, and that's what your face looks like. So it can allow for a very different style of photography and videography as well. And when it comes to video, a lot of people do like using wider angle lenses for videos like this, for YouTube, not necessarily just for vlogging, but also videos like this. Like Potato Jet is very renowned for having a very wide angle lens. I'm pretty sure he uses a 16 to 35, and he'll have it like on the table right in front of him, and it feels like you're closer to, like, the audience, we're closer to that person, and that person is closer to the audience, because they physically are. The lens is like this far away from them, but we can see everything, and it just feels a little bit closer. And that can definitely give that sort of feeling and that sort of vibe to videos, if you were going to do talking head stuff like this with a lens like this. And I have done a lot of talking head stuff with this lens ever since I got it, because this was the only lens I had for a while before I got the 85. Now, talking about the lens itself. Now, this is the FE 1.8 20mm G lens. So it's f1.8, it's 20mm, and it's a G series lens. It's not a G Master, which is their highest tier of lens, and it is a G, but G is sort of their second tier. They have like the older ones, like that. Actually, this 85 is not a G or a G Master. It's below that. Those ones are fairly old, but they do still sell them. So this is built much like a G Master. It's, a lot of people compared it to the 24mm G Master, which is like just renowned as like a very, very good lens. And this has a lot of similarities to it. The build quality, like it feels, you know, like it's built well. It's got a little bit of weight to it, but it's also not heavy, if that makes sense. Like it feels heavy enough for it to be built well, but not so heavy that it, you know, is cumbersome. And it's also relatively small. Like if we take the lens hood off, that's it. That's how big a 1.8 20mm lens is. So that's pretty good. The actual specs of it though, it has a 67mm front filter thread, which is pretty common. It's the same as my 85, so if I get filters, then I would use the same either filter diameter or step-up ring for these two lenses. It has a manual focus ring, of course, and it feels really nice. I do like the feel of this focus ring. It's a little on the light side. I wish it just was a little bit more resistance. But the biggest thing is it's a very short throw. Like you can go from close focus distance to infinity like that. It's like, I don't know what the actual numbers are, but it's ridiculously short. And I feel like they could have benefited from having a longer focus throw so you can actually manual focus more accurately, because it's very hard to get precise manual focus, especially on moving subjects with such a short focus throw. And that's why cinema lenses have really long focus throws. But this clearly is not a cinema lens. Much like cinema lenses though, it does have an aperture ring, and just like all the G Masters and all the G lenses coming out now as well, it is clickable. So, and I've talked about this when I first unboxed this lens. You can click it, or there's a switch right here. You can have no clicks. And then the only sound you're hearing there is when it hits the end of the stop. You can also click it into the A mode, which is then it's just controlled entirely by the camera. If it's in the mode with all the actual markings on it, if basically manual, if it's in manual mode, we'll call it, you can't change the aperture on the camera at all. You have to do it on the lens. It of course has an autofocus manual focus switch, and it has a custom button which on these Sony cameras you can just set to pretty much whatever you want. I have it to turn on and off face detect autofocus, so if I want to not detect faces and I want to focus on something else, I'll click it to turn it off, and then vice versa if I want to turn it on. I don't know if that's the best use for it, but I haven't really tried anything else yet, but maybe I will. I don't know. If you have any suggestions on what else I could set the button as, I would be open to it. It's also pretty well weather sealed. You can see and feel the rubber gasket on the back. Gasket? I've only seen Americans talk about it, and they say gasket, but I'm pretty sure it would be, like, we would say gasket. Like basket. Right? Anyway, it is well weather sealed. There is that rubber on the back. It's also sealed at all the switches, dials, and everything. Haven't tested it. I'm not going to go dunk it in water to see, but you know, I trust this more in the rain than I would this one, because this 85, older, cheaper, definitely not going to be as well sealed as this. The autofocus on the A7 IV with this lens is great. Like, I haven't really had any issues with it at all for vlogging or for any talking head stuff. Like, this lens is fine as well. I can move around as much as I want and it'll stay on my eye. And the autofocus speed is really nice, but it doesn't look too fast in video. I'm pretty sure I just have all the settings set to whatever the standard one is, so you could probably make it faster, but autofocus is great. But then the one thing that this is sort of missing, and one of the reasons why they can make it so small, is it does not have any optical stabilization. So some of the older lenses would have optical steady shot. This and a lot of the newer lenses don't have optical steady shot, and I think that's just because IBIS, the in-body stabilization, is good enough in the modern cameras that you don't really need it. However, like Sony are still making some cameras without it. For example, the FX6 does not have in-body image stabilization, so you would want stabilized lenses, or to use it on, you know, a stabilizer like a gimbal or a Steadicam or something like that. But that's sort of one downside to this, is you then kind of have to rely on the in-body stabilization because there is no optical stabilization in the lens. But that is also one of the ways that they were able to make it so small, so it's sort of the trade-off there. And basically my experience with this lens, it's my first full-frame lens, and it's the only lens I had with my A7 IV for a couple of months. The one thing that's good about using it with the A7 IV is I can go into APS-C crop mode and still get 4K video at what would be an equivalent of 30 millimeters. So I actually have used that a lot because I do like the look of, you know, more like the higher focal length lenses, hence why I got an 85. But I prefer the look of the 30 over the 20. But I did get the 20 mil because I knew that vlogging was something that I wanted to do, so I wanted to make sure that I could do that when I wanted to, and then other lenses will fill in the gaps there. For example, the next one I want to get, I think, is a 50, but like the 50 millimeter G Master, so it'll be a good 50. But I've used it for vlogging, and it is very good, nice and light. Like I said, autofocus stays on my face the entire time. It's great. It is good to be able to adjust the aperture easily, so if it's too bright, then I can just give the aperture ring a bit of a turn and fix the exposure. For example, if I'm outside and it's sunny and I don't have an ND filter because I don't have any ND filters at the moment, I'll just have to stop down the aperture. And then actually one thing that I did do, I was doing a sort of, I'll call it like documentary style filming of something that was happening. And what I actually did is I went on to the declicked mode for the aperture ring, and I controlled light and depth of field by that. So because it was that sort of like documentary style and it was indoors, I was around like f4 to f8 most of the time because I wanted a bit more in focus. But then when I went into a dark room, I just bumped it straight back to 1.8 so I could not have my ISO at 12,800. Because this is not an A7S III. Like I mentioned before, for portraits, it's an interesting one. I'm actually pretty happy with a couple of portraits that I have taken with this lens. Not saying I would use it as my main portrait photography lens. I would definitely use the 85 more. But it can definitely give an interesting look, especially the way that it makes faces look if you're not too close to them. Because that's the thing. That's what makes things look weird on wide-angle lenses, is when you get so close to them that the perspective, it just makes things look weird. And that's something that I'm not sure if a lot of people know. It's how compression works, and I didn't explain this very well in my video about it. But compression is more about the distance to the subject and the perspective caused by that distance, rather than the actual lens itself. So as long as you're not right up in someone's face like this, then it's not going to elongate their nose and make their face look really deep. But then the downside is they'll just be smaller in the frame. So that's one of the reasons why this is not a classical portrait lens. Some other photos that I've taken, like just going on walks and taking photos of stuff, I'm happy with a lot of these. Particularly the ones that I've taken of me walking, where it's just like you just see my leg. Now those ones would have been kind of funny to watch me take because I didn't set up the camera beforehand, didn't put it on a timer or anything. I'm not actually walking. I was holding that pose, and it probably looked really awkward to do, and it felt very awkward to do, but I like this photo in particular, this one with the grass. And there's some other decent ones, and one of the things that I've noticed, particularly with photos, is to get, you know, that benefit of the 1.8 and the shallow depth of field, you do actually have to get reasonably close with a wide angle lens like this, because you just, if you're too far away, you're just not going to get a very shallow depth of field. And that's pretty common, but it's more exaggerated with the wider the lens is, basically. So that's the Sony 20mm f1.8G. If you want to see a video about the 85mm lens and 85mm lenses in general, click here. And if you want to see the last video about my A7 IV rig, you can see it here. Or actually, if you want to see a video about the A7 IV for vlogging, click on this one. There's those three. Alright, subscribe and like and stuff, and okay, bye.